If you only watched Iran from a distance, you could miss the whole story. You would see the things countries are supposed to have: elections, campaigns, televised debates, a president standing at a podium, speaking in the language of government, diplomacy, crisis, reform, national destiny. You would see motorcades, summits, cabinet meetings, state visits, flags, applause. And you would assume what most outsiders assume, that this man, whatever his ideology, whatever his faction, whatever his promises, is the one running the country. That is the image Iran presents to the world. And it is real, just not in the way people think. Because in Iran, the presidency is not a false office. It is a real office inside an unreal assumption. The Constitution does say the president is the country's highest official after the office of leadership. It gives him executive responsibilities, public legitimacy, and national visibility. People vote. Presidents rise and fall. Faces change. Slogans change. The tone of government can change. But hidden inside that same sentence is the trap door. After the office of leadership. Except in matters directly concerned with the leadership. That is not a footnote. That is the architecture of the state. And once you see that architecture, the whole picture starts to distort. The president is not standing at the top of the Iranian system. He is standing beneath something. Above him is an office that does not campaign the way he campaigns, does not answer to voters the way he answers to voters, and does not need to win the public mood in order to remain the center of gravity. The supreme leader holds sweeping authority over the armed forces, over the general direction of the system, over key appointments, and even over the formalization of the president's election itself. So the man the world recognizes as Iran's leader is, in constitutional reality, operating inside boundaries another office can define. That is the first shock in this story. The second is even more unsettling. Because Iran's power does not simply sit above the presidency, it also surrounds it. There are institutions that can review laws, shape eligibility, arbitrate conflicts, discipline the political field, and make sure that elected office never becomes fully sovereign. The Guardian Council is one of the most important. It does not just sit in the background like a ceremonial constitutional body. It can determine whether parliamentary laws conform to the Constitution and Islamic criteria, and it qualifies candidates for the presidency, parliament, and the assembly of experts. In other words, part of the system's genius is that it does not merely react to elections. It helps define what kind of election is allowed to exist in the first place. This is why the story of Iran is so often misunderstood. People argue about which president was more pragmatic, more ideological, more confrontational, more reformist, more competent, more reckless. Those arguments matter. Presidents do matter. They can influence policy, rhetoric, diplomacy, domestic atmosphere, and the emotional temperature of the country. For ordinary people, the difference between one presidency and another can feel enormous. But the deeper question is not whether presidents matter. The deeper question is who decides how much they are allowed to matter. And that is where Iran stops looking like the republic many imagine and starts looking like something more layered, more disciplined, and more controlled. From the outside, that can sound abstract, a constitutional technicality, a matter for legal scholars and regional analysts. It is not abstract at all, because when a country is built this way, every election carries two stories at once. There is the visible story, the one the cameras can capture, the candidates, the speeches, the promises, the victory, the hope, the fear. And then there is the hidden story, the one that determines whether any of that can move the system's deepest levers. One story belongs to public politics. The other belongs to the machinery that contains public politics. One story asks who won. The other asks what winning is allowed to mean. That is why so many moments in Iran seem, from the outside, to end in contradiction. A president is elected, and yet key lines do not move. A government changes its face, and yet the structure keeps its nerve. The language of reform rises, then hits a wall. The language of resistance hardens, then still answers to something higher. To an outsider, it can feel confusing, even irrational, as if Iran is forever acting against the apparent logic of its own institutions. But the logic is there. It was there from the beginning. The mistake is assuming the presidency was ever meant to be the final source of power. And once that illusion breaks, the entire country looks different. The president is no longer the answer. He is the entrance. The visible face of a system whose deepest decisions are shaped elsewhere, filtered elsewhere, enforced elsewhere. Which means that to understand who really runs Iran, we have to go back to the moment this republic was built, and to the idea that made sure elected office would never sit alone at the top. Because in Iran, the election is real, but it is not the part of the system that decides how far power can actually go. To understand who really runs Iran, you have to go back to the moment the old order collapsed. Because the Islamic Republic did not emerge from a calm constitutional debate. It was born out of revolution, fury, humiliation, and a national rupture so deep that millions of people with very different dreams briefly moved in the same direction. In 1978 and 1979, the monarchy of Mohammad Reza Shah fell under the weight of repression, inequality, political exclusion, economic strain, and the long shadow of foreign interference. The revolution that took its place was not carried by one ideology alone. It drew in the secular left, religious conservatives, bazaar merchants, students, workers, nationalists, and clerics, all united by one immediate goal: end the Shah's rule. That is the first thing that matters. The revolution began as a coalition, but it did not end as one. The fall of the Shah opened a vacuum, and in revolutions, vacuums do not stay empty for long. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini returned not just as a dissident cleric, but as the figure who could turn moral authority into political command. Many people believed they were entering a future of self-rule after dictatorship. What they actually entered was a struggle over what self-rule would mean, who would define it, and whether the people would truly sit above the state or merely inside a state designed in their name. This is where the story stops being a simple revolution and becomes something stranger. Because the Islamic Republic was not built as a standard republic with religious symbolism attached to it. It was built as a republic under supervision. Elections would exist. State institutions would exist. A president would exist. A parliament would exist. But over all of them would stand a principle that changed the meaning of every office beneath it. Vilayat-e Faqih, the guardianship of the jurist. Khomeini's idea was that Islamic government could not be left entirely to ordinary political competition. It had to be guarded by a qualified religious authority who could preserve the revolution's direction and ensure that the system remained faithful to Islamic rule. That sounds theological. In practice, it was constitutional steel. The post-revolution constitution did not simply create institutions, it embedded a hierarchy. Article 5 placed leadership during the occultation of the 12th Imam in the hands of a just and pious jurist. Article 57 declared that the three branches of government operate under the supervision of the absolute Wilayat al-Am and the leadership of the Ummah. This was the crucial move. The state would still have republican organs, but they would not be sovereign in the way outsiders usually imagine. Their legitimacy would flow upward into a guardianship structure that could stand above electoral politics and contain it. And that means the contradiction was there from the beginning. Iran's new system promised popular participation, but it was designed to distrust unconstrained popular power. It embraced elections, but refused to make elections final. It spoke the language of the people while building a mechanism to protect the revolution from the people's changing moods. That is why the Islamic Republic can feel so confusing from the outside. It contains two instincts that live in constant tension with each other. One says legitimacy comes from public participation. The other says legitimacy must be guarded from public volatility. One opens the door. The other stands behind it with a key. And once that logic entered the Constitution, the rest followed naturally. Bodies were created or empowered to enforce ideological boundaries. Clerical oversight was woven into the legal order. The system was not meant to be neutral between competing political futures. It was built to defend one revolution against all others, including the revolutions that might arise from inside its own electorate. That is why the structure of the Islamic Republic should not be understood as a later betrayal of 1979 alone. In a deeper sense, it was one of 1979's outcomes. The revolution overthrew a monarchy, but it did not produce a fully open republic. It produced a guarded republic. A state with ballots, institutions, and public offices, but with a ceiling placed above them from birth. That ceiling is the key to everything that comes next. Because once you understand that the presidency was built into a system of supervision, the question changes. It is no longer enough to ask who won an election, or which faction is rising, or which president seems stronger than the last. The deeper question is who sits above the contest itself? Who defines the limits? Who commands the state when its visible institutions collide with its founding doctrine? Who, in the end, is not just part of the republic, but placed above it? And that is where the machine reveals its true center. If Section 2 was about how the machine was built, this is the moment you see where its weight really sits. Because Iran does not simply have a powerful religious figure watching over politics from a distance. It has an office built into the constitutional core of the state, an office designed not to advise power, but to sit above it. And once you understand that office, the presidency starts to look different. Smaller, conditional, almost theatrical in comparison. The supreme leader is often described abroad in language that sounds vague or ceremonial, as if he were a symbolic elder, a spiritual guide, a moral reference point hovering above ordinary government. That description is comforting. It is also misleading. In the constitutional design of the Islamic Republic, the leader is not a commentator on the state. He is one of the main reasons the state exists in the form it does. Article 57 places the legislative, executive, and judicial branches under the supervision of the leadership. And Article 110 lays out powers so broad that they reveal the real hierarchy in plain text. This is where the illusion of the president begins to crack open. Because Article 113 does call the president the highest official in the country after the leader. That is the line most outsiders never hear in full. After the leader. Not beside him, not balancing him, not checking him. After him. The presidency is powerful in the way a top executive inside a larger system can be powerful. It can manage, represent, negotiate, and administer. but it does not sit at the summit from which the system takes its final shape. And Article 110 makes that reality impossible to ignore. The supreme leader determines the general policies of the Islamic Republic. He supervises their execution. He is commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He can declare war and peace. He appoints, dismisses, and accepts the resignation of top military commanders. He appoints the head of the judiciary. He appoints the clerical half of the Guardian Council. He appoints the head of the state broadcasting system. He appoints key figures whose power reaches deep into the security and constitutional life of the Republic. And, crucially, the president's election is formalized only after the leader's endorsement. The office the world sees at the front of the stage is, from the system's point of view, not fully complete until power above the stage says it is. That changes everything. It means Iran is not just a republic with strong religious influence. It is a republic structured around an unelected, sovereign center. The president can make speeches to the nation. The leader can shape the limits of what the nation's state is allowed to become. The president can promise a direction. The leader already occupies the office that defines the acceptable map. One governs within the frame. The other helps decide where the frame is. And this is why so many presidents in Iran appear larger from abroad than they are at home in the power structure. From the outside, the president is legible. He appears in headlines. He meets foreign leaders. He speaks in the language of diplomacy, sanctions, crisis, reform, resistance. Cameras follow him because cameras can follow a president. But the deeper Iranian system was not designed around visibility. It was designed around control. Much of its true force sits in offices and institutions that do not need the same kind of performance because they do not depend on the same kind of public approval. The leader's authority is not an accessory to the state. It is one of the state's organizing principles. That is why moments of apparent presidential momentum in Iran can be so deceptive. A president can win with enthusiasm. He can arrive with a mandate, with a constituency, with the emotional energy of a country that wants change. But he enters office already downstream from a constitutional source of power he does not control. This does not mean presidents are meaningless. They can matter enormously in tone, policy emphasis, and national atmosphere. But there is a difference between influencing the weather and owning the sky. In Iran, the presidency often does the first. The office of the leader was built to hold the second. And yet even this is only part of the truth. Because power this concentrated does not survive on one office alone. It needs guardians, filters, enforcers. It needs institutions that can protect the system before public politics ever gets close to threatening its foundations. Which means the real genius of the Islamic Republic is not just that it placed one office above the state. It is that it built gatekeepers around the state too. Now the story turns. Because it is one thing for a president to discover that someone above him holds ultimate authority. It is something else entirely to realize the system has already shaped the field before the public ever enters it. That is the role of the Guardian Council. Not loud enough to dominate foreign headlines every day, not visible enough to become the face of the regime, but essential to how the regime protects itself from the risks of its own elections. On paper, the council can sound almost technical, a constitutional body, a legal checkpoint, a panel of clerics and jurists making sure laws and elections comply with the rules of the republic. But that calm description hides the deeper reality. In Iran, rules are not neutral terrain. They are one of the ways power is exercised. and the Guardian Council sits exactly where legality and control begin to merge. Its composition tells you almost everything you need to know. The council has 12 members. 6 Islamic jurists are selected directly by the leader. The other 6 are jurists elected by Parliament from among nominees put forward by the head of the judiciary. And the head of the judiciary, as we already saw, is himself appointed by the leader. So even where the process appears mixed, the chain of influence bends back upward. The body that is supposed to safeguard the system is, by design, deeply tied to the same apex of power it helps protect. Then come the powers. Every law passed by Parliament must be sent to the Guardian Council. The Council reviews it for compatibility with both Islam and the Constitution. If it objects, the legislation goes back. If it approves, the law can move forward. It can even extend its review period when needed. And the Council is not merely checking procedure from the outside. The Constitution explicitly allows its members to attend parliamentary debates and make their views known on pending bills. In other words, the elected legislature does not simply legislate and then face review. It legislates in the shadow of an institution that can intervene, reinterpret, and send its work back across the table. But the deepest power of the Guardian Council is not what it does after elections or after legislation. It is what it does before choice becomes choice. Article 99 gives the Council responsibility for supervising presidential elections, parliamentary elections, Assembly of Experts elections, and referenda. On paper, that word supervision can sound passive, almost administrative. In practice, the Council's role has long given it enormous influence over who is even permitted to compete. CFR notes that the Guardian Council qualifies candidates for the presidency, Parliament, and the Assembly of Experts, giving it major power to set the boundaries of Iranian electoral democracy. This is the part outsiders often miss. Voting exists. Campaigning exists. Ballots are counted. But before the nation chooses from the menu, someone else helps decide what is on the menu. That is the contradiction at the heart of the system. Iran does not abolish elections. It disciplines them. It does not always need to falsify the performance if it can shape the cast. The public still participates, still hopes, still fears, still turns out or stays home. But the field is narrowed in advance by an institution whose loyalties are not to open-ended political competition, but to the preservation of the Islamic Republic as defined from above. Once you understand that, elections in Iran stop looking like a simple contest between rival futures. They start looking like a contest inside guarded boundaries. And the Council's power goes even further. Article 98 gives it authority to interpret the Constitution itself. That means it is not only reviewing laws and supervising elections. It is helping define the meaning of the system's foundational text. So the same institution can influence who gets to run, what laws can survive, and how the Constitution is officially understood. That is not a procedural footnote. That is a gatekeeper with keys to several doors at once. This is why the presidency in Iran can be so deceptive from a distance. By the time a candidate reaches the national stage, delivers speeches, raises expectations, and asks for the people's trust, the deeper system has already been at work. The visible drama begins after an invisible sorting process. And that means the public is not simply choosing a leader. It is choosing among leaders a guarded order has deemed tolerable. But here is where the story gets even darker. Because even after a candidate survives the gatekeepers and wins the office everyone can see, he still has to govern inside the same machine that filtered him on the way in. This is the part of the story that hurts people most. Because the presidency in Iran is not meaningless, that would make the system easier to understand. The presidency matters enough to change tone, priorities, budgets, and the atmosphere of public life. Brookings notes that the office has real power to shape domestic and foreign policy, including the budget and the framework for internal political activity, while CFR's reporting shows the president has sway over domestic policy, even as he lacks control of the armed forces and holds relatively few powers of his own compared with the deeper centers of the state. That is exactly what makes the office so emotionally potent. It can change enough to raise hope, but not enough to own the system. And once you see that pattern, Iranian politics starts to look less like a sequence of different presidencies and more like a recurring drama with the same ending. A candidate rises. The campaign fills with language the public has been waiting to hear. Restraint, reform, justice, stability, dignity, resistance, renewal. The country votes, not because everyone believes the system is free, but because enough people believe the office still matters. Then the winner enters government and discovers what every president eventually discovers. He has reached a high office, but not the highest power. He can move pieces on the board. He cannot decide where the board ends. Look at Mohammad Khatami. His presidency showed why the office could inspire genuine excitement. Britannica notes that Khatami, elected in 1997 with strong support from youth, women, and intellectuals, emboldened reformists who wanted a more moderate Iran. Brookings credits his administration with curbing some abuses, opening new avenues for political participation and speech, attracting foreign investment, and improving Iran's relationships abroad. For millions of Iranians, that was not a cosmetic shift. It felt like a door opening inside a system that had long felt sealed. But then, the ceiling appeared. Britannica says tensions between Khatami and conservatives grew quickly, with key supporters prosecuted and harassed, while his efforts at rapprochement abroad were hindered by domestic opponents. Brookings is even sharper. Khatami's ambitions were limited by loyalty to the theocratic system itself, and even his mild reforms were thwarted at every turn by hardline opposition. That is one of the most revealing phrases in this whole story. Mild reforms, thwarted at every turn. Not because the public had not spoken, they had, but because in Iran, popular energy can lift a president into office without giving him the authority to break the architecture around him. Then came the inversion. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad is often remembered abroad as the embodiment of hardline presidential power, but even his story reveals the same structure. Brookings describes his first-term alignment with the supreme leader and later transformation from acolyte to whipping boy, a shift that gave the political establishment whiplash. In other words, even a president who seemed ideologically aligned with the system's hardest edges was not free from the hierarchy above him. He could be elevated, useful, even backed. But he could also be cut down when presidential ambition or political disorder stopped serving the balance of the deeper state. The problem was never just reformist presidents. The ceiling applied to presidents as such. Then the cycle repeated with Hassan Rouhani, only in a more sophisticated form. Rouhani came to office as a pragmatist with an appeal to exhausted voters and a reputation for negotiation. Brookings notes that his road ahead depended on wrangling support from hardliners and preserving at least tacit backing from Khamenei, while the security establishment deeply resented his diplomatic approach to the nuclear issue. He could win the office. He could not govern as if winning the office had settled the argument. His presidency, like Khatami's before him, was a reminder that in Iran, elections can redirect pressure without relocating sovereignty. That is the real cruelty of the presidency inside this system. It is strong enough to absorb the nation's expectations, strong enough to become the vessel for people's fear, hope, anger, and tactical compromise. But it is weak enough to be contained by institutions that do not have to stand before the public in the same way. Which means the office performs two functions at once. It governs, yes, but it also protects the system by taking the emotional weight of demands it may never have the power to satisfy. It becomes, in effect, a pressure valve for a state built not to surrender its deepest levers. And this is where the story gets darker again. Because once elected leaders hit the ceiling, the question is no longer who disappointed the country. The question is, who stands behind that ceiling, who benefits from it, and who can enforce it when politics is no longer enough. And at that point, the story stops being mainly about constitutions and campaigns. It becomes a story about men with guns, networks, money, and a mission larger than any president's term. Once presidents hit the ceiling, the story stops feeling merely constitutional. Because a constitution can limit a president, a council can filter a ballot, a judiciary can narrow a law. But none of that fully explains how a system keeps its nerve when pressure rises, when anger spills into the streets, when factional conflict turns dangerous, or when the state decides it must protect itself at all costs. For that, Iran built something else. A force created after the 1979 revolution, outside the regular military, designed not just to defend the country, but to defend the revolution itself. That force was the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. From the beginning, the IRGC was different from an ordinary army. Britannica notes that it was established by Ruhollah Khomeini in April 1979 to unify and organize paramilitary forces committed to the revolution, and to serve as a counterweight to the regular army, which had been loyal to the Shah. CFR says Iran's clerical leaders created it outside the traditional armed services precisely because they distrusted those older institutions. That distinction matters. The regular military was there to defend a state. The guards were there to defend a revolutionary order, an ideology, and the men who claimed authority in its name. Then, the Iran-Iraq War changed everything. What began as a revolutionary force hardened under fire. Britannica says the war expanded the IRGC's role, size, and stature dramatically, helping transform it from a limited state militia into Iran's most powerful armed force. The war did not just militarize the guards, it sanctified them. It gave them blood memory, institutional prestige, and a founding myth of sacrifice that the presidency could never compete with. Presidents came and went. The guards carried the story of survival. And unlike the president, the IRGC does not answer to the electorate. Britannica describes it as the most powerful branch of Iran's armed forces, independent of the regular army and accountable only to the office of the supreme leader. CFR likewise says it answers directly to the leader. That means the force with some of the country's most consequential coercive power is not downstream from parliament, cabinet politics, or public mandate. It is tied to the same sovereign center that already sits above the presidency. The elected state may govern in public. The guards are wired into the state's protected core. Over time, the IRGC grew far beyond a military formation. Britannica says it developed its own army, navy, air force, and intelligence wing. CFR adds that it operates Iran's ballistic missile arsenal and oversees the Quds Force, its expeditionary arm for regional operations. This is where the documentary's tone has to darken, because the story is no longer only about institutional hierarchy. It is about reach. The Guards are not simply a shield around the regime. They are one of the regime's instruments for projecting force abroad and shaping outcomes beyond Iran's borders. But their importance inside Iran may be even more revealing. CFR describes the IRGC as central not only to external power projection, but also to internal security and national politics. Britannica notes that the organization intervened in political affairs during Mohammad Khatami's presidency to counter his reform agenda, and that under Ali Khamenei, it became deeply entrenched in regime security and able to undermine civilian political processes. That is the crucial turn. The Guards did not remain obedient muscle standing silently behind the curtain. They became political actors in their own right, with a direct stake in how far reform could go and how tightly the system would hold. Then came money. CFR says the Corps has enriched itself with billions of dollars through illicit commercial and financial networks around sanctions, while the USIP Iran Primer describes the Guards as Iran's most powerful economic actor and says the IRGC and its associated companies became involved in many sectors of the economy, amassing unprecedented power. That is the moment a security force becomes something even more formidable. A military institution with ideology is dangerous. A military institution with ideology, patronage, and economic empire starts to resemble a parallel state. It can reward loyalty, punish rivals, and bind entire parts of the country's elite structure to its own survival. And when unrest breaks out, the system has more than soldiers. Britannica says the Basij, a branch of the IRGC, is easily mobilized and has taken a leading role in suppressing protests, including the 2009 election protests and the 2022-23 Woman, Life, Freedom protests. That matters because it reveals the real function of the Guards inside the Republic. They are not just there for invasion or war. They are there for moments when society itself becomes the threat, when the street refuses the script, when public anger starts pushing against the architecture we have been uncovering piece by piece. By now, the shape of power is getting harder to ignore. The supreme leader stands above the presidency. The Guardian Council filters political entry, and the IRGC exists as the armed, ideological, and increasingly economic force that helps guarantee the system's continuity. USIP describes the relationship bluntly. Khamenei and the Revolutionary Guards formed a symbiotic relationship that buttresses the leader's authority and preserves the status quo. Which means the real story is not that Iran has one ruler hidden behind a president. The real story is that it has built an ecosystem of protection around the regime itself. And once that ecosystem is in place, power no longer needs to sit in one office alone. It can spread through courts, councils, networks, and loyal institutions, each one making sure that if one layer bends, another layer holds. By this point, the pattern is already unsettling. The president is not at the top. Elections are filtered before they begin. The Guards stand behind the regime with force, ideology, and money. But the deeper brilliance of the Islamic Republic is that it does not rely on one office or one armed institution alone. It layers power. It builds overlap. It creates a system in which one body can restrain another, but the final direction still bends back toward the same center. That is what makes Iran's political architecture feel less like a pyramid and more like a fortress. Take the judiciary. On paper, the Constitution gives it a noble role. Article 156 calls it an independent power, responsible for justice, rights, legal enforcement, and the prosecution of crimes. If you stopped there, you might imagine a branch standing apart from politics, guarding the law against power. But then Article 157 closes the distance. The head of the judiciary, the highest judicial authority, is appointed by the leader for 5 years. Article 158 then gives that appointee control over the structure of the judiciary, the drafting of judicial bills, and the hiring, dismissal, transfer, and promotion of judges. In other words, the judiciary is called independent in principle, but its commanding gate is installed from above. That contradiction is not a technical detail. It is one of the system's survival tools. Because courts do not merely punish criminals. In a state like this, they can define who counts as a threat, who gets silenced through legal procedure, and how the line between dissent and danger is drawn. Even the administrative link to the executive reveals the hierarchy. Article 160 says the Minister of Justice is chosen by the President from among people proposed by the head of the judiciary. So the elected executive does not simply meet the judiciary as an equal branch. It encounters a legal order whose upper chain is already connected to the leader's system of appointment. The law, in this structure, is not outside power. It is one of the rooms power lives in. Then there is the Expediency Council, and this is where the architecture becomes even more revealing. At first glance, the body sounds almost procedural, a mechanism to solve institutional deadlock. Article 112 says it convenes when the Guardian Council rejects a bill and Parliament cannot satisfy the Guardian Council's objections. That sounds like arbitration, like a constitutional safety valve. But read the design more carefully. The Council meets upon the order of the leader. Its permanent and changeable members are appointed by the leader, and it can consider any issue forwarded to it by the leader, along with other responsibilities assigned in the Constitution. CFR puts it bluntly. The Expediency Council is another avenue through which the supreme leader can choose to exercise closer authority over the government. That means even conflict inside the system is contained inside the system. Imagine the sequence. Parliament passes legislation. The Guardian Council pushes back. A dispute emerges that, in many countries, might become a test of institutional balance or democratic supremacy. But in Iran, the body that resolves the deadlock is itself appointed from above. The argument may look horizontal, branch against branch, but the settlement channel is vertical. The state appears to contain internal friction, yet the friction often resolves inside machinery ultimately shaped by the same sovereign center. It is not chaos. It is controlled circulation. And the Constitution makes that logic even harder to miss. Article 110 gives the leader authority to delineate the general policies of the Islamic Republic after consultation with the Expediency Council, and to resolve problems that cannot be solved by conventional methods through that same body. So the Council is not only a referee between Parliament and the Guardian Council. It becomes a channel through which exceptional problems can be elevated into a realm already defined by the leader's authority. Normal politics reaches a dead end, and the answer is not more public sovereignty. The answer is a higher chamber of supervised resolution. This is why Iran can feel so impenetrable from the outside. Every time the viewer thinks they have found the decisive institution, another layer appears behind it. The president has a mandate, but not the final say. Parliament can legislate, but not alone. The judiciary speaks in the name of law, but its apex is appointed from above. The Guardian Council reviews the system, and the Expediency Council reviews the collision between institutions. The whole order is built to make sure no single elected office can suddenly turn popular energy into sovereign power. One chamber narrows the next. One ceiling sits beneath another. And that is the psychological core of the regime. It does not trust politics to remain politics. It assumes politics can become danger. So it creates backup structures, reserve powers, supervisory bodies, interpretive bodies, and legal bodies, all capable of catching shocks before they reach the foundation. The result is not a simple dictatorship wearing Republican clothes. It is something more durable and, in its own way, more sophisticated. A state that has learned to absorb conflict by routing it back toward protected institutions before it becomes existential. But that design has a hidden weakness. Because the more a system depends on one sovereign center to hold its layers together, the more dangerous the future becomes when that center is threatened, weakened, or gone. And in Iran, that is not a theoretical problem. It is the question waiting beneath every election, every crisis, every crackdown, every carefully managed display of continuity. What happens when the man above the system is no longer there to hold the system together? Every system reveals itself most clearly at the moment it fears most. For Iran, that moment has always been succession. Not an election, not a cabinet reshuffle, not even a protest wave, however dangerous. The real test comes when the office above every other office is threatened, weakened, or suddenly empty. Because once a state is built around a leader who stands over the presidency, over the courts, over the armed forces, and over the broad direction of the republic, the deepest question is no longer who governs today. It is what happens when that center disappears. The Constitution answers that question with an appearance of order. Article 107 says the task of appointing the leader belongs to the experts elected by the people, the body known as the Assembly of Experts. Article 111 says that if the leader dies, resigns, or is dismissed, the experts must move within the shortest possible time to appoint a new one, while an interim council temporarily takes over the leader's duties. On paper, that looks like continuity. It looks procedural. It looks stable. But like everything else in Iran, even the succession mechanism comes wrapped in contradiction. The Assembly of Experts is elected by the public, yet the Guardian Council supervises those elections. That means the body charged with choosing the next leader does not emerge from open political competition. It emerges from a field already filtered by a system loyal to the existing order. Carnegie's recent analysis says the March 1, 2024 Assembly election had been stacked with hardliners through disqualifications of moderates and reformists, explicitly in preparation for the succession process. So even the institution meant to oversee the highest office is itself shaped by the architecture it is supposed to navigate. That is why succession is so revealing. It exposes what the regime actually trusts. Not the public, not fluid politics, not a sudden opening. It trusts managed continuity. It trusts clerical procedure inside controlled boundaries. And above all, it trusts institutions that can preserve the system's identity, even if the man who embodied that identity is gone. CFR warned in February 2026 that any change in leadership would be historic, but also that the implications would ripple far beyond Iran, because the office had become central to regime preservation, regional influence, and the Islamic Republic's internal hierarchy. Then, in 2026, the fear stopped being theoretical. Reuters reported on March 1st that Ayatollah Ali Khamenei's killing had plunged the Islamic Republic into its most perilous crisis since the 1979 revolution, confronting it with war on its own territory, unresolved succession, and mounting internal strain. But Reuters also noted something crucial. Analysts cautioned against assuming rapid collapse because Iran's order had been deliberately constructed to avoid reliance on a single leader, dispersing authority across clerical institutions, the security apparatus, and power networks. In other words, the regime's most dangerous moment was also the moment its underlying design became visible. That visibility matters more than any single personality, because succession in Iran is never just about who comes next. It is about whether the system can prove that it is larger than the man at its apex. Carnegie noted that once Khamenei died, Article 111's interim mechanism was activated, and a three-person council took over temporarily while the assembly of experts moved toward choosing a new leader. The point was not only legal continuity, it was psychological continuity. The regime needed to signal, to its own people and to its enemies, that the chain had not broken. And then came the answer. By March 9th, CFR reported that Iran had named Mojtaba Khamenei as the new supreme leader, a hardliner seen as close to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. However one reads that outcome, the deeper meaning is hard to miss. The succession did not produce a democratic reset. It did not elevate a reformist opening. It did not dissolve the structure we have spent this entire film uncovering. It reproduced it. Even a once-in-a-generation rupture was processed through the same guarded machinery of continuity, security, and regime preservation. And that is the fear beneath the system. Not simply that the leader might die. Leaders die. The deeper fear is that succession could escape management, that the transfer of power could become a moment when public anger, elite rivalry, military interests, and institutional weakness collide at once. That is why the system prepared so carefully. That is why the assembly mattered so much. That is why the guards loom so heavily in every serious discussion of the future. Reuters put it starkly. The balance now hinges on whether the IRGC emerges weakened by conflict and internal frictions, or more entrenched, closing ranks around a harder, more security-driven approach to governance. So yes, succession is a crisis, but it is also a confession. A confession that the Islamic Republic knows exactly where its real center has always been. And a confession that the presidency, for all its visibility, was never designed to solve the regime's biggest problem, only to help manage the surface while deeper forces protect the core. Because if the system can survive even the loss of the man above it, then the president starts to look like something else entirely. Not the ruler of Iran, but one of the instruments that helps the regime survive the appearance of change. By now, the obvious question is impossible to avoid. If the supreme leader sits above the state, if the Guardian Council filters who can run, if the Judiciary and Expediency Council help lock disputes back inside the system, and if the IRGC stands behind it all with force and reach. Then why keep a presidency at all? Why keep elections, campaigns, debates, slogans, promises, the whole visible drama of public politics? Because the presidency is not a mistake in the system. It is one of the system's instruments. First, legitimacy. For decades, the Islamic Republic has needed more than coercion. Chatham House argues that the regime has long relied on a managed form of electoral legitimacy, and that elections have been used to legitimize the power and influence of the ruling elite. That distinction matters. The ballot box does not have to be fully free to be useful. It only has to preserve the idea that the public is still inside the story, that the state is not merely ruling over society, but speaking in society's name, that there is still a channel, however narrow, between power and the people. Second, pressure management. Brookings makes an essential point that many outsiders miss. Iran's elections are not meaningless theater. Even heavily controlled elections can become critical junctures in the life of the system. Campaigns create openings for candidates to challenge official narratives, for journalists to test the limits of censorship, and for large numbers of people to mobilize around grievances. In Brookings' phrase, these semi-democratic institutions have a subversive utility. That is precisely why the regime keeps them, and precisely why it fears them. Elections ventilate pressure. They give anger a route, hope a vessel, ambition a timetable. But they also allow the state to monitor society, measure discontent, and absorb demands that might otherwise erupt outside institutional channels. Third, elite management. The Islamic Republic was never a monolith. Brookings notes that throughout its history, it has contained an evolving competition for influence, with elections offering openings for ambitious contenders and rival factions to reposition themselves. That means the presidency is not only for the public, it is also for the regime itself. It gives elites a controlled arena in which to compete, signal strength, test coalitions, and negotiate the internal balance of power without blowing up the entire order. The office helps manage conflict inside the establishment by channeling it into a contest the deeper system still supervises. Fourth, the presidency still performs real work. This is what makes the office so deceptive. Brookings argues that the presidency has real power to shape the budget, the framework for internal political activity, the social and cultural atmosphere, and even parts of security policy. The president is also the face most legible to the outside world, the person foreign governments can meet, negotiate with, pressure, praise, or condemn. But Carnegie notes that unelected institutions under the supreme leader have increasingly sidelined the foreign ministry and expanded their own role in foreign policy, making it unlikely that a new president would fundamentally alter that process. So the president becomes a kind of translator. He can present Iran. He cannot fully redefine it. He can carry the message. He does not own the message's deepest source. And then there is the darkest function of all: blame. When the economy suffers, when hopes collapse, when reform stalls, when diplomacy fails, the presidency gives the system a visible place where frustration can land. The office matters enough to attract expectation, but not enough to control the deepest levers that often shape the outcome. In effect, it becomes a shield for the regime and a container for public disappointment. People can turn their anger toward the government of the day, while the architecture above that government remains more insulated, more permanent, more difficult to touch. That is one reason turnout matters so much. Chatham House noted in 2024 that low turnout in the presidential election reflected an unprecedented disconnect between state and society. When fewer people believe in the visible layer, the invisible layer loses one of its most useful defenses. So the presidency survives because it does many things at once. It lends legitimacy. It releases pressure. It manages elite rivalry. It gives the world a negotiable face. It gives society a language of participation. And, when necessary, it absorbs the emotional cost of failure for a system built to keep its core elsewhere. The illusion is not incidental. The illusion is functional. Which means the answer to our title is darker than "not the president." The real answer is that Iran was built so no president could ever truly run it. So who really runs Iran? Not the president, not parliament, not any one televised debate, campaign slogan, or electoral upset. The real answer is harsher and more important. Iran is run by a layered system built to make sure elected office never fully controls the state. The presidency is real, but it exists beneath a structure designed to supervise it, narrow it, and, when necessary, overrule it. That structure begins with the office of the supreme leader, but it does not end there. It extends through the Guardian Council, the Judiciary, the Expediency Council, and the Revolutionary Guards, each reinforcing the same underlying principle. The Republic exists, but it exists inside guardianship. That is the final reframing of this story. For most outsiders, Iran looks like a country with a strong presidency and an unusually powerful religious establishment. But that explanation is too shallow. The deeper truth is that the Islamic Republic was engineered to absorb change without surrendering control. Its elections can shift tone, style, and policy emphasis. They can even produce real moments of hope. But the architecture above them was built to keep the revolution's core levers out of ordinary political reach. The system does not merely tolerate elections, it contains them. That is why the presidency matters so much to ordinary people, and yet so often fails to deliver what people pour into it. The president is the office closest to public expectation. He is the one who speaks to the nation, travels abroad, names priorities, and absorbs the emotional weather of the country. Today, that office is held by Masoud Pezeshkian, the reformist-leaning surgeon and lawmaker elected in 2024 after the death of Ibrahim Raisi. But even that fact, however politically meaningful, does not alter the deeper map of power. The president can influence the system's surface. He cannot alone command its foundation. And the events of 2026 made that reality impossible to miss. After Ali Khamenei's death, the question hanging over Iran was not whether the presidency would stabilize the republic. It was whether the regime's higher machinery could reproduce itself under pressure. It did. According to recent reporting and analysis, Mujtaba Khamenei was elevated as the new supreme leader, confirming that even a once-in-a-generation rupture would be processed through the institutions built to preserve continuity at the top. That was the moment the whole illusion snapped into focus. The presidency did not become more central in the greatest crisis the system could face. It became even more peripheral. And that is the aftershock this story leaves behind. Because it means the real stability of the Islamic Republic does not come from popular consent in the ordinary democratic sense. It comes from overlapping mechanisms of supervision, discipline, and succession. One institution filters the field. Another interprets the rules. Another arbitrates the deadlock. Another enforces the order with arms, intelligence, and networks of patronage. The result is not simple dictatorship. It is something more durable and, in its own way, more difficult to confront. A regime that has spent decades learning how to survive pressure by distributing control across mutually reinforcing centers. Which is also why misunderstanding Iran can be so dangerous. If you mistake the president for the true sovereign, you will misread almost everything that follows. You will misunderstand why reform stalls, why foreign policy often outlives electoral moods, why institutions seem to move at different speeds, and why moments that look like openings so often end in containment. You will keep watching the visible government while the deeper state does the work that matters most. And you will miss the central fact that millions of Iranians live with every day. The system can invite participation without ever fully yielding power to it. That is the tragedy buried inside the design. Iran is not a country without politics. It is a country saturated with politics, argument, ambition, disillusionment, and longing. Its people vote, debate, calculate, protest, adapt, and endure. But they do all of that inside a structure built to distrust unconstrained public sovereignty. The system offers a republic, then places guardians above it. It offers choice, then limits the field of consequence. It offers a president, then makes sure the state's deepest fate is decided elsewhere. So the title's answer is now clear. Who really runs Iran? A layered regime of protected power, in which the president is the face the world sees, while the real command of the state is distributed through institutions built to defend the revolution from the full force of electoral change. The presidency was never meant to be the throne. It was meant to be the negotiable surface of a system whose hard center sits deeper, darker, and far less exposed. In Iran, the president may speak for the state, but the system that decides the state's fate was built to answer to something else entirely.